Welcome, everybody, and appreciate your time here on a Thursday afternoon. In Chicago, we're just getting through some heavy rains. I thought I was going to have to build an ark, but it's actually sunshine now, and it's supposed to be a beautiful weekend. So, well, let's get started. I'm Bob Kuntz with High Reliability Group, and today's webinar is about the role of the management system. So we're going to go through that today in the 30 minutes that we have together, and I hope everybody enjoys. Everyone's on mute right now except for Jeff and I. If you have questions, don't be afraid to throw them into the chat room. We'll see those and we'll try to answer them. And we will have some questions at the time for some questions at the end. But if you have them as you go, please throw them out there. A little bit of background real quick on our company, High Reliability Group. Not a big company, but a bunch of ex-Navy nukes that think that we have a little bit to add to the industry, various industries. Jeff was a former submarine junior officer and engineer, and then went on to an illustrious career in various industries, but ended up at Chevron and was general manager of their operational excellence management systems, and then just retired and recently has joined our company. So this is not only a webinar to get some great information from Jeff, but also a welcome to the company. So thanks for joining us today, Jeff.
Okay, I'm joining.
So real quickly, for anybody who's never studied the High Reliability Organization concept, just a quick definition, and this is not a definition that's like a physics definition. There are arguments about various, what is a high reliability organization, but if you're not on the webinar, you're calling in, you maybe don't have the slide. It's an organization that has succeeded in avoiding catastrophic events in an environment where normal accidents may be expected due to risk and complexity. So what does that mean? It means, a company or an organization that is somehow in a very high-risk environment has been able to avoid major catastrophic events. And there's very few examples of this out there. If you want to study kind of the academic side of it, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago, Wyke and Sutcliffe wrote a book. There's some academics out of, I believe, the University of Michigan, and actually they did some studies back in the 80s of aircraft carrier flight deck operations with a retired admiral, and they studied how do these 19-year-old kids on this aircraft carrier, how do they operate with pretty high level of safety and mission accomplishment in a very dangerous environment. And they studied that, and they went on to study various other industries and organizations. And they wrote a book called Managing the Unexpected. Very good, thorough book. If you haven't read it, you should. But it is an academic theory written by academics, right? So I will say that, my studying of it, I learned a lot, but I also kind of took away that, well, okay, how do I apply that? And so Matt DiGeronimo, who was my chief engineer on USS Key West, and I wrote a book last year called Extreme Operational Excellence. And all we did was try to really share the Navy nuclear culture. For those who have served in the nuclear Navy, whether surface ship or submarine, you know that Admiral Rickover really set up a culture based on 5 basic principles. And this is more of an operational culture, less of a, how we wear our clothes and stuff like that. But, I'm talking about the operations, mostly of the propulsion plant, but of course they tend to creep into other areas of submarine operations especially. But, we think there are 5 basic principles or 5 basic pillars that the Navy nuclear culture was based on. It's somewhat of a knowledge-based learning organization. There's a high level of formality, and what that is procedural compliance and formality and communications. And then the real differential piece, I think, is the questioning attitude that our sailors and officers get ingrained in them almost from day one. After you learn the systems and the procedures, and then you're qualified to operate, you're expected to be thinking about what could go wrong. Wyke and Sutcliffe talk about a preoccupation with failure, and that's really kind of maps to questioning attitude. If you take any one of Wyke and Sutcliffe's 5 principles, and I did this a couple of weeks ago, you can map those directly over to the Navy nuclear culture, in my mind at least. But preoccupation with failure is this sense of questioning attitude that is instilled in all of us as Navy nuke operators. when I turn this valve, what is the system going to do, and what do I expect it to do, and what could go wrong, and what would that look like? And it also watch team backup, which is an integral part of that. Okay, if I see something that I don't understand or a system responding in a way that I don't expect, what do? I don't just keep that to myself. The last thing we wanted to hear in what we called a critique, which is what we did when something went wrong to try to get to the root cause. We didn't want somebody to say, well, I knew it was going bad, or I thought that looked like it was going to be a problem. In the oil and gas industry, people use the phrase speak up. And that's really what we're talking about with watch team backup. As the captain of the submarine on USS Key West, I expected all of my sailors and officers to challenge me on things that I said or orders I gave, and not every day and not every order, but because that just leads to chaos and anarchy. But what you wanted was a highly trained, knowledgeable workforce that then looks for problems, potential problems, and is willing to speak up and question them. And it's really a balance that you have to strike. And then finally, integrity is a piece that wraps around it all, and that's more of a process integrity. Personal integrity, very important, of course, to any organization. But process integrity or system integrity do you do what you say you're going to do? Do you follow up with problems when they pop up, or do you just brush things under the rug because you don't have time or don't want to invest the resources? And one thing I learned in my time, especially as an inspector on the Nuclear Propulsion Examining Board, it was those organizations that would consistently, with integrity, follow up on these issues that popped up. Because every company, every organization has problems. It's a matter of how you deal with them, and are you consistent? Does your process have integrity? So these are the 5 pillars of the Navy nuclear culture, if you will. If you want to read more about them, you can pick up our book and check it out. And I think that it gives a very practical methodology or kind of way of an operating company should look at things, and maps from the basic High Reliability Organization academic work that Wyke and Sutcliffe and others are doing. So just wanted to review that really quickly with people to kind of get on the same page. Further talking about high reliability organizations, culture is what we think is the ultimate. If you can build a culture that is very strong based on those 5 principles, you're going to have a high reliability organization. But there are other elements, of course. There's leadership required, right, at all levels. You have to have engaged, responsible, and accountable leadership. And you also have to have a management system. And this is what we're going to focus on today. And glad that Jeff has joined us, as he spent a lot of his career working with Chevron and other organizations on management systems. Now, I didn't use the words management system as a naval officer. It wasn't something that, in our vernacular, we didn't talk about our management systems, but we certainly had a lot of management system, or an integrated management system, I guess you would call it, where we believed in policies, procedures, and processes. And I'm going to talk just a few minutes about procedures because it's one of my, I don't know if pet peeves are right, but I focus on procedures a lot because, quite frankly, I was surprised what I found when I got out of the Navy and into various industries. And I've been retired now from the Navy for 5 years, worked in various power generation, done some work in oil and gas, transmissions, and a little bit of manufacturing. So I've had a broad spectrum of observing organizations, and procedures is an area I think that everybody that's in a high-risk industry really needs to embrace the concept. So now in the Navy, we had procedures for everything. And those of you that served remember, there was actually a procedure usually on the wall of the head, and for good reason, because sometimes those tanks could be pressured to several hundred pounds. And I actually had a few people that walked away with not so pleasant experience because they didn't follow the procedure. But I throw this up kind of jokingly, but kind of not. Yes, we had procedures for everything in the Navy, but we also recognize that there's a spectrum of when you follow a procedure verbatim, meaning you have the procedure out and you're following almost like a checklist. If anybody's a taproot person, Mark Paradise built the company Systems Improvement, and he built a taproot root cause methodology. And he defines a procedure is actually following a checklist of steps. So I like that in some ways, although I don't completely agree with it. But if you think about that as far as procedural compliance, are you going to have a book out if you're doing an operation that's pretty routine? Probably not. But if you're starting up a nuclear reactor the first time in, let's say, 5 weeks after a maintenance period, it's very important at that point to be following the procedure verbatim, because the risk is of high consequence. So there's a spectrum of when the book is out, when the procedure is out, and you're following step by step and you're communicating each step. And the other end of the spectrum is pretty routine operations, whether that's a high pressure air compressor that started on a routine basis on your wash station, or you're starting up a made feed pump in a power generation plant. And in those cases, you had a highly qualified operator, and you didn't necessarily need the procedure out and going through step by step. It depended on the proficiency and the qualification status. But in any case, procedures were ingrained in the nuclear Navy culture as being your guide, your friend. If you followed the procedures, and they were good procedures, well-written procedures, written in blood in some cases, and you could trust them. So I was surprised when I got out of the Navy and started studying these accidents that would occur at various places, and especially in the oil and gas industry. And this particular one, the Texas City refinery, is one of the accidents that I study quite a bit because of all the great lessons that can be learned from it. Unfortunately, 15 people died in this accident, and it's a tragedy, of course, but there's so many great things to learn from this. And one of the things I pulled away, and I left the comment here, or the quote on the bottom from Andrew Hopkins' book, Failure to Learn, but procedures were just not at all embraced by this refinery at the time. And I'm not trying to pick on BP, but the culture within that organization was not one where procedures were meant to be followed verbatim. And it's really striking that they were doing a startup of this plant and filling this distillate column, which was 100 and I think almost 70 feet tall, with a highly flammable liquid and vapor, and weren't following the procedure and allowed the actual liquid level to go above the indicating range, and it spilled out and obviously caused a vapor cloud that it got ignited, which resulted in the death of 15 people. And so when I started studying that, I would have thought this was something that was 100 years ago. This is the way we operated, but this was just 12 years ago, last month. And so anyway, I'm kind of a little bit on a mission to make sure that cultures of high risk, high hazard organizations embrace the use of procedures. And that's part of what a management system is. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff now to talk a little bit more about management systems as a whole and how you use those to safeguard your organization. So, Jeff?
Okay. All right. Thank you, Bob. So what I thought I would do is give you a little bit of the current thinking, and it ties real well into what Bob was just talking about, that this is the current thinking from my former employer, Chevron, just less than a week. And again, I retired from Chevron, and I've also worked in a variety of other industries. And so this is information that I've gleaned from working out in a variety of different companies. And just to touch on procedures again, just in one business unit within Chevron, they typically will have over 5,000 procedures. And so, and I can tell you in Chevron and other companies that I've worked, the procedures are very, very poorly written, and they also don't keep up with management of change or changes in the organization. And so you have to have an overall management system to manage the risk that you have within a company. And it's got to be part of the complete system, the operational system that the company has, because at the end of the day, the company needs to produce something and be profitable to survive. So the management system has to be integral with how a company actually operates. And our current thinking is that leaders, from a safety and health standpoint, leaders can't manage outcomes. They think they can manage outcomes, and it feels good to believe you can manage outcomes, but what you can really only manage is the process. You can manage the process, and you can manage the safeguards that protect the public protect the workers, and protect our shareholders. So for us, the focus is first understand what are your key risks in those activities that you perform as a business that are going to have a high consequence outcome. And leaders need to preferentially focus on high consequence outcomes. And then their role as a leader is to manage the high consequence safeguards to make sure those are in place, functioning effectively 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So, and we look at this as from a full gamut of not only safety and health, but process safety, safety and health, environment, reliability, how you run reliably, security, both cybersecurity and physical security. Also, you have to look at your risks from a stakeholder and issues management and legislative standpoint on what could affect the business in the future. We can operate one way today, but we may have to operate a different way tomorrow based on how regulatory changes happen. And then also you want to have an efficient organization. So you have to look at all your risks, not only safety and health, but you understand those risks and you have a risk profile and you have to understand that and manage it. And then for a high reliability organization, let me pause and go back to Weick and Sutcliffe. The issue we had with Weick and Sutcliffe when we studied that from a high reliability organization, and Bob pointed it out, is you could hand the book to a leader and then the leader would say, well, what do you want me to do? You know, how do I become more sensitive to operations? How do I make sure that, we can use some of those concepts in there? And then and what you really need to do is give a leader the how. And so in this diagram we have, the other thing is you need to build error-tolerant systems once you understand your risks. And that's where procedures come in. Procedures help you build the error-tolerant systems. You don't need the procedure for everything in business, but you need it for those critical activities where the risk of failure is unacceptable. And so you prioritize procedures. And in our business, a lot of our business units have started calling them not just procedures, but critical operating procedures. And they say which things do we need to follow verbatim and which things are a guideline for the operator to do its work. And then you need to build in the fact that humans are going to make mistakes, which we did in the nuclear Navy. We built that into all of our systems, and we double, triple check those things where we couldn't afford to have a human failure. So you need to understand where you can fail, understand where you've got administrative controls, not engineering safeguards, and then make sure you protect those high consequence activities by managing those safeguards. And then you have to have a process that will implement and maintain those safeguards. How do I know those safeguards are in place and functioning? When do I need to go out and check my control systems and do the verification that the control system is operating, my high-level alarms, low-level alarms, my shutdown systems are operating as functioning? How often do I need to check those based on the consequence of failure and then how those things may drift? How often do I need to go out and watch work is performed to understand how we deviated, because we imagine that work will take place in a certain fashion or we plan for that, but the work actually happens in a different way out in the field. And so you need to understand, have you drifted away from what you want to have happen, and then be able to adjust the system. And then you need to systematically integrate learning into the system, just like Bob has in his book about being a really learning culture. And you need to systematically, and businesses do a good job of sharing. They do a very poor job of actually learning. So how do you systematically learn? How do you understand the work that's being performed? How do you understand the gaps and deltas in that work? And then after you've had an incident is one time we learn, but we actually need to learn as work is being performed, as maintenance is being performed. We need to learn all the time and then strengthen our system and strengthen our safeguards. And the system only works when you can actually learn and systematically improve the system so that the system is going to help you manage those safeguards. So this is the process that we've been evolving to in Chevron. Let me just talk a little bit about our risk profile. Is actually what we're developing out of there's a variety of systems that businesses use to understand the risks of their activities. So from a process safety standpoint, use process hazards assessments, use hazard and operability studies, layers of protection analysis, bow tie analysis. You use a variety of things to help you from a process safety standpoint understand what are the key safeguards that you have in your system. But how you analyze the risk is going to be different in each of those different cases. Your environmental risks, the risk profile is going to look different. You've got emissions that you need to manage, spill control. If you're talking in the oil and gas industry, is how I'm going to manage my system to make sure that I've got secondary containment, that those things are in place, and that we're not going to have a spill that'll reach the environment. From a drilling standpoint, how do I make sure I've got well control and that I've got the integrity around that well system, so I can contain the hydrocarbon in the reservoir, or as it moves through the system to produce it, that's going to be managed. So those are all the things. Those are the things that we would look at in the risk profile, and then you can look through those and high grade those and decide what are those things that we as a leader at the highest levels need to pay attention to. What are those enterprise crippling events, those events that will cause a fatality we need to manage? And then as I move down to the front line, what are those risks that I as a frontline supervisor need to manage? My lockout, tagout, or isolation of hazardous energy if I'm a frontline supervisor, lifting and rigging, working at heights. If I'm supervising the head operators or the board operators in the refinery, what are the things that I need to manage from a process safety standpoint that I need to understand in my sphere of influence? And then making sure that as you move through the various levels in the organization, each person can understand what their risks are. So hopefully that helped a little bit. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bob.
Hey, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate that. I actually have a question for you, and I didn't prepare you for this, so I apologize. But as you're talking, you and I have both been studying human performance a little bit lately, and I know you've got more in-depth understanding of it. But as I study all of these different kind of elements of high reliability or operational excellence, human performance, a lot of people are moving in that direction, and I think seems to be like a misunderstanding or kind of not. How does that work within a management system, and does that mean we don't need procedures if we reach some nirvana with human performance? What exactly is this idea of human performance? Could you share that in a couple minutes?
Sure. I can do that. So the first, there's a couple of key things. First of all, I'll tell you a little story. As I was sitting next to our president of manufacturing in a meeting where we were talking about human performance, and we've got a series of human performance principles. First one is people will make mistakes, and we've got 7 of those, and I'll be happy to share those on another time. But principle 1 is people will make mistakes, and I was sitting next to our president of manufacturing as we were going through this presentation, and he turned to me and he said, "Jeff, people make mistakes." And I said, "Yeah, Gary, I know, it's principle number 1 that's up there." And we're going on and talking about something else in these principles. And he turned to me again and he says, "Jeff, people make mistakes." And then he went back to, and I said, "Gary, yeah, I know, it's number 1 up there." And he kept going for a few more minutes, and he turned to me and he had a look of horror on his face, and he says, "Jeff, people make mistakes." And it dawned on me that here's our president of manufacturing. He had a 40-year career in Chevron, and he had spent his entire career building systems assuming people would operate perfectly and never ever make a mistake. And they had no backup to that. So that's from a human performance standpoint, and you building error-tolerant systems, what we're talking about is where is your system vulnerable to people making a mistake? And so a procedure is a time that it inserts something into the system that can ensure that someone will follow the steps as they're designed to be followed, and you can specify that those need to you can't deviate from that procedure. You have to use a procedure for those activities. So building error tolerant, the human performance piece is building error tolerant systems and understanding where people will make mistakes and where you can't afford to have them make a mistake? Where do you need to second check? Where do you need to have a checklist? Where do you need to have a procedure? Where do I need to have some sort of interlock in the system? Should I have an engineering control versus a procedure to make it less vulnerable to people making mistakes? So that's just a brief piece of that. One other aspect of it is the work is always changing, and so people will try to gravitate to the most efficient, effective, and safe way to do the work out in the workplace, and it's very different than we had in the nuclear Navy in a lot of cases. And so understanding that variability in the work, and have I introduced any new risks into the system as that variability of the work changes, and understanding that, and then making sure that I'm managing those safeguards is in my mind what human performance is all about.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's very insightful the way you explain how a very experienced, 40-year leader looked at the world differently. Because I know from my training in the Navy, we looked at things always as, the human is going to make the mistake. I mean, I use the term sailor proof because that's kind of what we used in the Navy, but we knew the human element was going to make a mistake. And so we actually designed our work packages and our quality and everything around, humans making mistakes. So it's almost it's the polar opposite kind of viewpoint. And I think that's very enlightening to understand that. So I like that. Thank you. All right. Well, we're running.
One other thing. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just said we're running out of time, but real quick, if you have one more thing.
Yeah, I think the other thing is one of our other principles is, and Mark just pointed this out to me, is that accidents aren't deliberate. People don't come to work expecting to make mistakes and to hurt themselves or hurt their colleagues. And so it's very rarely a deliberate act. And again, I think it's up to leaders to develop the systems to make them human-proof, sailor-proof, error-tolerant. You can pick your own word, but that's a leader's role, is to help the organization do that. So.
Right. Yeah. Good. I couldn't agree more. So, well, I'm going to open it up real quick. We just have maybe a minute or two here left, but start on time and end on time. That's the high reliability way. And so any questions, if you have one, just throw it there into the chat room. I see Tim maybe typing one up. He'll probably give me a stumper. He was always good at that. But let's see if we get any questions in. Well, no questions so far. So I think, we got 1 minute here to wrap up. I'll just finish with, if this was interesting to you and you want to dive in deeper, no pun intended there, we are holding a workshop down in Houston on May 9th. So a little bit of an advertisement here, but we're going to hold a one-day workshop. We're really going to limit it to about 25 folks and dive into some of these high reliability organization principles and really sort out, practical methodologies. I mean, Jeff's going to be there. Mark's going to be down with us. We've got the folks from ATR who do the software for smart procedures coming in just to give us a little bit of insights into some of the procedures, issues that they're seeing out in various industries. So it's going to be a jam-packed full day in Houston. I'm going to start early in the morning at 8 and finish by 5. And I guarantee you it'll be a lot of deep understanding. So if you're in Houston or you can make it down for the day, it's great. You can get a link here from our this presentation, which I'll send out to everybody who participated today. And we're actually offering a 25% discount off the ticket price if you use the code word webinar. So don't forget that. If you have any trouble with anything as far as registering or need more information, you can contact me at rkuntz@highrelgroup.com. You can also go to our website here at highrelgroup.com and workshop and get some more information. So I do see Tim said, all right, good stuff. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, shipmate. Glad you could join us today. Buy you a beer sometime. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to sign off now because it's 1:30 on the dot. Thanks for your time. Thank you, Jeff, for joining us today. And everybody have a wonderful and safe day. Take care.